All right, it looks like we are good to go. My name is Hannah Mortensen, and I am the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. And today we are here to talk about pipelines. We are doing a short question and answer series. We have done these before about climate change, and we'll continue to do these throughout the fall. So please, if you're on Facebook, please submit a question in the comment box if you have any. We'd love to hear it. Even if it doesn't get answered right away and you have it later, we'll try to answer it as best as we can. So I would like to introduce Dr. Jed Downs, and I'm going to give it to him right now to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jed Downs. I practiced occupational medicine for over 20 years, and the education for that includes not only the MD degree, but also getting a master's in public health and environmental health. And so that's where my background is. I am currently in a second act working as a manual osteopath. I am a member of the Wisconsin Environmental Health Network because all that education still needs to be used for good. And even though I've gone off on a different branch, I still want to be able to contribute whatever I can for the benefit of society.
Thank you, Jed. Yes, you've been great as a WEHN board member, and we're happy to have you here and use that knowledge. So my first question for you on the pipeline topic is, I think there's a lot of misinformation, or people just don't know a lot about pipelines. So to begin, what do pipelines even carry?
Well, there are a lot of different things that they can carry. There is a federal agency called the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and they oversee, to some degree, pipelines that might be carrying things such as crude oil, natural gas, but also hazardous materials within facilities and so forth. For the most part, when people think of pipelines, however, they're thinking of petroleum products at some stage of purification.
Okay, so there's quite a few things that can happen along that. So we know that much about pipelines, but what are some of the health consequences that can happen from these pipelines? Whether that's leaks or spills or what's actually in them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, sure. I mean, the type of hazard is going to be contingent upon what's inside the pipeline. So natural gas pipelines, for instance, there are about 75,000 miles of natural gas pipelines in Wisconsin. The primary thing you have to worry about there is the possibility of leaks and explosions and that sort of thing. The most recent episode for our area was the episode in Sun Prairie in 2018, when there was a leak because a contractor hit a pipe that wasn't appropriately identified, and it ended up flattening a city block, killing the volunteer chief of the fire department in Sun Prairie. And there are about 4,000 utility lines hit in Wisconsin in any typical year. Not all of them are going to lead to leaks, but it's a common occurrence. All right, so that's gas pipelines. Okay, the other type of pipeline that we're oftentimes concerned about are the pipelines which are carrying petroleum products, typically crude oil or some basic derivative of crude oil. They can sort of go for liquefied fractions of crude oil or crude oil, and the materials that are being transported through Wisconsin are typically coming from Alberta, the tar sands area of Alberta, which is which has specific hazards associated with it. The tar sands are so thick that they can't be pumped through a pipeline, until they're treated. Okay, so if you can kind of imagine something probably on the order of, okay, if you had a jar of peanut butter in your refrigerator, okay, the kind that separates, the old-fashioned kind, that bottom part is the tar sands from Alberta, okay? And you can't get it to pump until you stir in lighter materials to mix it up so that it'll actually begin to flow. It'll also flow if you heat it, but you can't heat a pipeline along this entire course. You can heat a railroad car, and they sometimes do, which is kind of got its own risks and hazards. So anyway, that dill bit is what is called diluted oil, diluted bitumen. That was the source of a spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 2010. And that spill was like 800,000 gallons. The operators didn't recognize that it was happening, and it happened in July. So what happens then is when you spill this stuff, all the light stuff that you added to the dill bit evaporates off, and you're left with this heavy, junky residue. And it took Enbridge over 4 years to clean it up, and it cost them at least $1.2 billion, and probably they were anticipating another $250,000 or so in costs to be able to clean up the mess. And it basically, ruined 25 miles of the Kalamazoo River for that period of time.
So with that dill bit, in what you just talked about, that spill, what were some of the personal health consequences to some of the people in the area?
Well, some people were getting acute exposures initially, were getting, burning eyes and upper respiratory irritation, nausea and vomiting, and those sorts of things because of the irritant nature of some of the things that were evaporating off of the mixture. There are acute effects and chronic effects from exposure to solvents. The acute effects are the things I've sort of described. You can also it can work it can asphyxiate you, so that it basically, if the material which is evaporating off is heavier than air, it'll sort of flow along the ground, and it can displace oxygen, so you can end up with a lack of oxygen and just die on that basis. You can have CNS sort of anesthetic effects, like basically like huffing glue or something like that. So you can, you can lose your orientation and not necessarily behave appropriately in the face of a spill. In the chronic setting, there is something called solvent-induced encephalopathy, and that basically begins with forgetfulness, and it's basically kind of a dementia. There are some components of crude oil, such as benzene and other things, which are going to be carcinogenic. Benzene is really famous for causing leukemias, but people who live close to like fracking sites or pumping stations for gas have increased risks of stillbirths and preterm labor and that sort of thing. So it's not just people who've been exposed a long time, it's the fetus which is being exposed for a short period, a long time for its life, but not forever. Let's see, what else? There are things which are generated, like formaldehyde, which is also a carcinogen, especially where they have pumping stations. Okay, so the idea is a pipeline has to have the pressure increased periodically because there's drag as the fluids flow through the pipeline. So you have pumping stations, which are typically, for a natural gas line, maybe every 47 to 100 miles or so. And each one of those burns natural gas, but they create a lot of formaldehyde in the process of burning that natural gas. There have been leaks at pumping stations which have been associated with explosions and stuff as well. I'm forgetting what the question was that I was really answering.
That is all right, Jed. I think you covered it. It was kind of what the health effects, really
Sure.
were to the
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
And my next question for you is, is there that link, or could you describe that link between climate change and our health in these pipelines? Because pipelines, sounds like, are fossil fuels.
Okay.
Can you explain upon or elaborate a bit about that connection?
Oh, well, certainly. Number one, methane, which is natural gas, is a significant factor in terms of global warming. And there is a significant underestimation of the amount of methane which is being leaked at fracking sites, at what are called the collecting pipelines, which take the things from the fracking site or a drill site to a processing facility, every pumping station, and the way that the safety is, so that pipelines don't explode under increased pressure, is they're constantly venting this stuff. If they get too much pressure, they vent it off so they don't get an explosion. And so you have all this methane, which is like per molecule is like 83 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. It does break down over time, like 80 years, but so you've got that issue as far as climate change. The other aspect in terms of climate change is that whatever comes out of the end of the pipeline is going to be burned. That's what we use it for, is we burn. So whether we burn it as gasoline, burn it as diesel fuel, burn it as propane, burn it as some heating homes, or the really disgusting fuel called bunker fuel, which is used in like boats and stuff, where like on Great Lakes, the freighters and stuff like that, they use bunker fuel, which has to be heated to 200 degrees before it's liquid enough so that you can actually put it through an engine. All that stuff ends up being burned and becoming CO2, or it's going to have some degree of off-gassing of, there's also going to be particulates which come off from the incomplete combustion, and the particulates are known factors for not only asthma as a direct irritant, but also put people at increased risk for heart disease and stroke as well, because the particulates get absorbed through the little air sacs in the lungs and get into the bloodstream, where they can have health effects there.
Great, thank you for making that connection, Jed, and bringing in those direct health effects, because they are there and they're apparent. And so we've got a question here about what someone can do about it. So I'm going to actually answer this one. So what someone could do about this, for example, in Wisconsin, Enbridge Line 5 is in the process of doing a reroute. And right now, Sierra Club of Wisconsin is doing a petition to stop the entire Line 5. So I put the link in the Facebook post where you can click on that and sign the petition. But I encourage everyone, at least in the Wisconsin area and even Michigan, to really pay attention to the news. There might be public comments, public meetings coming out about the reroute of Enbridge Line 5. So feel free to bring in those health effects that you just learned about, because that's what everyone is being affected by too, is those direct health effects. So again, that link is in our post, and keep your eyes and ears out for things to come. Jed, do you have any other last thoughts you want to share?
Well, with regards to Line 5, we need to also bring up the idea of environmental degradation, okay? Because, one of the issues with Line 5 is that that at one point Enbridge had permission to be able to run Line 5 through the Bad River Reservation. And the Bad River Reservation took that permission away. And so Enbridge is planned on rerouting around the Bad River Reservation, but at the same time, the pipeline is going to go through the watershed which feeds the Bad River Reservation. And if there were to be a spill in that area, it would still destroy their property, their way of life, and really Enbridge is treating that population of people as being disposable, and their way of life as being disposable. So it's a real situation where environmental injustice is potentially taking place. The other thing is that the Line 5 goes through the Straits of Mackinac, or the Mackinac Straits, and if there were a spill there, which is actually somewhat possible, there's been erosion of supports that are underneath the pipe. There's an acid component to oil. You can talk about sweet oil, which doesn't have a lot of hydrogen sulfide, or sour oil, which does, and that it can act as an acid. And so eventually the acid sort of eats away the inside of the pipeline. And so there are areas where like a quarter of the original thickness of the pipe is gone in the Straits of Mackinac at this point. And so if you've got lack of support, you've got thin pipes, and you've got an area where there are a lot of unstable currents, and you could have a spill that could, cover 150 miles of Great Lakes shoreline and affect the drinking water for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that live on Lake Michigan or Lake Huron.
Thank you, Jed, for bringing the emphasis of how important this is. And I think what you've talked about throughout this session is even more reason for everyone to take a look at pipelines, take a look at what's going on around us, and stand for change. And I really want to encourage everyone that there is hope that we can do something. So let's get together and make the change happen to protect our public health and to protect our environment. So I want to thank you, Jed, for joining us today to fill in. And I want to say that if anybody still has questions,